What if the most important relationship in Meghan Markle's life was the one no one was supposed to notice? Think about that for a second. Not her husband, not her ex-husband, not the prince who changed her life forever, but the man who was always there before, during, and after every transformation. A name that appears quietly, repeatedly, almost invisibly, a presence that never demanded the spotlight, yet somehow stood close to it every time the lights came on. Markus Anderson. For more than 25 years, that name has floated on the edges of Meghan Markle's story. Mentioned briefly, explained vaguely, dismissed casually, just a friend. But here's the question no one asked loudly enough. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Since when do just friends move through every chapter of your life without ever being left behind? Since when do they survive every breakup, every reinvention, every leap in status, power, and visibility? And since when do they remain untouched by explanation? This isn't a rumor recap. This isn't gossip for gossip's sake. This is about patterns, timing, silence, and silence, when repeated long enough, starts to speak. Let's start with a moment most people missed. A casual comment, a light laugh, a phrase that sounded harmless, almost throwaway. But when replayed years later, with context, with distance, with the full arc of events behind it, the meaning changes. It's not what was said, it's what wasn't. Meghan Markle has spoken openly about many people in her life. She has described love, heartbreak, betrayal, support, and isolation in detail. She has named names when it suited the narrative. She has painted villains clearly and heroes warmly. But when it comes to Markus Anderson, the language shifts. Shorter sentences, looser definitions, fewer details. Why? If he was insignificant, why not say so? If he was simply a friend, why not explain the depth of that friendship the way she has with others? Why does the story slow down when his name appears? And why, after 25 years of whispers, side glances, and quiet speculation, does the truth now feel closer to the surface than ever before? Here's the uncomfortable reality. Stories don't follow people like this unless they matter. Markus Anderson didn't just appear in Meghan Markle's life at one point. He didn't drift in during a single era and fade out. He didn't belong to a chapter that closed. He stayed. Before the fame, before the red carpets, before the palace gates, before the interviews that shook the monarchy. He was there when she was unknown. He was there when she was rising. He was there when the world turned against her. And he was still there when everything changed. That alone should make you pause. Ask yourself something honestly. How many people from your early 20s are still present in your life today? Not just present, but consistently connected to every major shift you've made. Not many. Now ask a harder question. How many of those people had access, influence, proximity, and discretion? Even fewer. And yet, Markus Anderson did. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for people who prefer neat narratives. Because neat narratives require categories. Friend, partner, colleague, acquaintance. But some relationships don't fit cleanly into boxes. Some relationships are strategic. Some are emotional. Some are transactional. Some are protective. Some are deeply private. And some are all of the above. Here's another thing no one likes to admit. Power doesn't always look like dominance. Sometimes it looks like presence. Sometimes it looks like being the one person who never leaves. Markus Anderson has often been described as a connector, a facilitator, a social operator. Someone who understands rooms. Someone who understands people. Someone who knows when to speak and when to disappear. That description alone tells you something important. This is not a passive role. This is not someone drifting through life accidentally. This is someone who understands leverage. So why was his role always minimized? Why was the public encouraged to see him as background noise? And why, now, does that explanation feel increasingly fragile? Because the more you look at the timeline, the harder it becomes to ignore. The more you map Meghan Markle's transitions, the more often his name reappears nearby. And the more often it reappears, the less convincing coincidence becomes. This story matters now because we are in a moment of re-examination. Old interviews are being replayed. Old photos are being studied. Old relationships are being recontextualized. What once looked harmless now looks strategic. What once looked casual now looks intentional. What once looked like friendship now looks complicated. And complication doesn't automatically mean scandal. That's important to say. This is not about accusations. This is about understanding how power, loyalty, and survival actually work behind the scenes. Because public narratives are rarely the full story. They are curated, edited, simplified. And the people who help shape them often remain invisible by design. Ask yourself this. If Markus Anderson truly didn't matter, why has no one ever explained him fully? Why hasn't his role been clarified cleanly and conclusively? Why does his presence linger like a question mark? And why does every attempt to dismiss him seem to raise more questions instead of closing the conversation? Sometimes the truth doesn't come out through confession. Sometimes it comes out through pattern recognition, through what repeats, through what refuses to disappear, through what remains constant when everything else changes. Meghan Markle's life has changed dramatically over the last 2 decades. Her status, her environment, her alliances, her public image. But Markus Anderson remained a fixed point. And fixed points matter. They anchor stories. They stabilize transitions. They provide continuity. They also hold knowledge. Knowledge of who you were before the world was watching. And that kind of knowledge is powerful. Which brings us to the most important question of all. What does it mean when someone knows your entire story? Not the public version. The private one. The version before the speeches, before the interviews, before the carefully chosen words. What does it mean when someone has seen every version of you and stayed anyway? And why would that relationship need to stay undefined? Because definitions invite scrutiny, and scrutiny invites questions. And questions, once asked, are hard to stop. So instead, the story was kept simple. He's just a friend. A phrase repeated often enough to sound final. But repetition doesn't equal truth. Sometimes repetition is protection. Protection of privacy. Protection of influence. Protection of a bond that doesn't benefit from explanation. And maybe that's the point. Because once you explain a relationship, you limit it. You shrink it into something digestible. And some relationships don't survive being reduced. They live in the gray areas. In the spaces between labels. In the silence. And that silence has lasted 25 years. Until now. Because something has shifted. The way Meghan speaks. The way stories are framed. The way the past is revisited. The tone has changed. The careful distance has softened. And in that softening, the truth doesn't burst out dramatically. It seeps. Slowly. Quietly. Through implication. Through omission. Through what finally feels safe to acknowledge without saying outright. Which is why this story matters now. Because we are finally far enough from the beginning to see the shape of the whole. And when you step back, when you connect the dots, when you stop accepting surface explanations, one thing becomes clear. Markus Anderson was never just a background character. He wasn't a footnote. He wasn't incidental. And he certainly wasn't temporary. The question isn't whether he mattered. The question is how. And that answer changes the way you see everything that came after. Because once you understand how Markus entered Meghan Markle's life, you'll realize the story you thought you knew was only half the truth. What if the most powerful person in a story is the one who never speaks? Not the star, not the villain, not even the hero, but the figure who stands just off to the side, watching everything unfold. Because when you look closely at Meghan Markle's life, really look, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every time her world shifted, one man was already there. Before the fame, before the relationships the tabloids obsessed over, before the royalty, the titles, the global scrutiny. Markus Anderson didn't enter the story halfway through. He was there at the beginning. And that changes everything. Let's rewind to a version of Meghan Markle most people have forgotten. Not the Duchess. Not the activist. Not the headline magnate. A young woman trying to position herself in a world where talent alone rarely opens doors. This is where the story usually skips ahead. Straight to television roles. Straight to red carpets. Straight to overnight success. But overnight success is a myth. Behind every public rise is a private infrastructure. Connections. Introductions. Safe spaces. Strategic friendships. And this is where Markus Anderson first appears. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But consistently. Early photos. Early circles. Early social environments where ambition mattered just as much as opportunity. Ask yourself something. How do two people remain connected for decades without drifting apart? Not just emotionally connected, but practically aligned. Careers change. Cities change. Relationships change. Yet Markus remains. Why? Because from the start, this wasn't a casual friendship built on convenience. It was built on understanding. Understanding of how worlds work. Understanding of who matters in a room. Understanding of how to move without being noticed. Markus Anderson wasn't famous. He wasn't trying to be. That alone set him apart. People chasing attention burn out quickly. People who control access last longer. And Markus understood access. He understood environments where influence wasn't obvious. Restaurants. Private clubs. Exclusive gatherings where conversations mattered more than appearances. These weren't places you stumbled into by accident. They were curated. And Meghan was learning. Learning how to read people. Learning how to adapt. Learning how to belong in spaces that weren't designed for her. That's not manipulation. That's survival. And Markus was already fluent in that language. Here's where the story gets interesting. In every phase of Meghan's early adult life, Markus appears not as a lead character, but as a stabilizer. When others came and went, he stayed. When romantic relationships flared and faded, he didn't disappear. When career momentum stalled, he didn't step back. He remained steady. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever had a friend who stayed equally close through every romantic relationship you had? No jealousy, no distance, no disruption. That's rare. And when it happens, it usually means one of two things. Either the relationship is superficial, or it's foundational. Markus wasn't superficial. He wasn't a weekend friend. He wasn't a party acquaintance. He wasn't someone who only appeared when things were good. He was there quietly, in the background, watching patterns form long before others noticed them. This is where people get uncomfortable, because they want simple explanations. They want to believe Markus was just nice to know, just a social friend, just someone who happened to be around. But coincidence stops being coincidence when it repeats across decades. And the repetition here is undeniable. As Meghan's visibility increased, Markus's proximity didn't change. That's the key. Usually, fame creates distance. People fall away. Some feel intimidated. Others feel replaced. But Markus didn't retreat. He adapted. And adaptation is not passive. It requires awareness. It requires emotional intelligence. It requires knowing when to step forward and when to vanish completely. Think about how little we actually know about him. That's not accidental. People who want attention leave trails. Interviews. Statements. Visibility. Markus left none of that. And that silence worked. It allowed the public to underestimate him. It allowed the story to focus elsewhere. It allowed him to exist without scrutiny. And that's powerful. Because when no one is looking at you, you can see everything. Let's talk about timing. Timing is everything in stories like this. Markus doesn't appear randomly. He appears at moments of transition. Moments when decisions are being made. Moments when direction matters. And those are the moments where influence counts. Not loud influence. Quiet influence. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that asks the right questions behind closed doors. The kind that offers perspective when emotions are high. Imagine being young, ambitious, uncertain, and surrounded by people who want something from you. Who do you trust? Someone who wants your spotlight? Or someone who doesn't need it? Markus never needed the spotlight. And that made him safe. Safety builds loyalty. Loyalty builds longevity. And longevity builds power. Here's another detail people gloss over. Markus never competed with the men Meghan dated. That's unusual. Friendships often fracture under romantic pressure. But this one didn't. Because Markus's role wasn't threatened by romance. He wasn't there to replace anyone. He was there to remain. And remaining takes discipline. It means knowing your place. It means understanding the boundaries without needing them spelled out. It means valuing the long game over short-term validation. That's not accidental behavior. That's strategic restraint. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why would a relationship like that need to be minimized publicly? Why insist on just a friend instead of embracing the depth? Because depth invites interpretation, and interpretation invites speculation. And speculation can disrupt carefully constructed narratives, especially when a story is still being written. This chapter of Meghan's life was about building confidence, building identity, building a sense of direction. And Markus was there for all of it. Not directing, not controlling, but observing, supporting, staying. People underestimate how powerful consistency is. It creates trust, and trust opens doors that charm never could. By the time Meghan's career began to accelerate, she wasn't navigating alone. She had someone who understood the terrain, someone who had seen her fail, someone who had seen her pivot, someone who knew which version of her was real. And that matters, because when the world starts projecting images onto you, having someone who remembers who you were before can either ground you or control you. Which one it was here? That's the question no one wanted to ask. Because the answer complicates everything. This chapter isn't about scandal. It's about foundation. And foundations are invisible once the building stands. No one looks at them. No one talks about them. But without them, everything collapses. Markus Anderson was part of Meghan Markle's foundation. And foundations don't show up in headlines. They show up in patterns. And the pattern here is clear. He was always there. And when someone is always there, they know everything. Your strengths, your weaknesses, your fears, your ambitions. That knowledge is intimate. Not romantic intimacy necessarily, but something just as powerful. Contextual intimacy. The kind that shapes decisions. The kind that influences direction. The kind that stays hidden until it doesn't. Because as Meghan's life moved toward its most dramatic transformation yet, Markus didn't fade into the background. He moved with her, silently. And that raises a question that becomes impossible to ignore as the story continues. If Markus was already this embedded before fame, what role did he play once the stakes became global? Because when the world enters your life, only a few people are allowed to stay close. And Markus was one of them. What if ambition isn't something you announce, but something you prepare for quietly? Because long before Meghan Markle ever stepped onto a red carpet, before cameras followed her every move, before the world argued about her intentions, she was already learning how to survive a system that doesn't reward talent alone. This is the part of the story that makes people uncomfortable. Not because it's scandalous, but because it's real. We like success stories to feel clean, inspirational, linear. But real ambition is messy, and the people who survive it rarely do so alone. Let's talk about the years before the spotlight, before the interviews, before the speeches, before the carefully constructed public identity. This was a period defined by uncertainty, auditions that went nowhere, rooms where she wasn't quite sure she belonged, a constant push to be taken seriously in an industry that reduces women to roles and boxes. And during this phase, Markus Anderson didn't just exist in the background. He became part of the infrastructure, not a manager, not an agent, not a romantic partner, something else, a translator of worlds, someone who understood how influence actually moved. Because here's a hard truth about ambition that no one likes to admit. Talent opens doors. Connections decide which ones stay open. Markus understood that. He understood spaces where deals weren't announced publicly. Spaces where conversations happened casually, but consequences lasted. Private tables. Invitations that didn't come with press releases. Networks built on trust rather than credentials. And Meghan was learning fast. She wasn't naive. She wasn't drifting. She was observing. And observation is the first step toward mastery. This is where people get the story wrong. They assume Markus was helping Meghan, as if she was passive. That's a mistake. This was a mutual alignment. She brought ambition, adaptability, and a willingness to learn. He brought access, understanding, and restraint. Restraint is important here. Because Markus never positioned himself as the face of anything. He didn't attach his identity to her rise. He didn't speak for her. He didn't claim credit. He stayed adjacent. And adjacency is powerful. It allows influence without exposure. Imagine being in rooms where decisions are made and never being quoted. Imagine shaping environments without leaving fingerprints. That's not accidental. That's a skill. And Meghan gravitated toward that skill because she needed it. She was navigating an industry that smiles publicly and exploits privately. An industry where being liked isn't enough. You need to be understood. And Markus understood how power actually worked. This is where the phrase, just a friend, starts to feel inadequate. Friends don't usually teach you how to read rooms. Friends don't usually help you navigate unspoken hierarchies. Friends don't usually remain relevant as your goals evolve. But partners in ambition do. And again, that doesn't automatically mean romance. It means alignment. It means trust built on shared objectives. Let's talk about trust. Trust isn't built through grand gestures. It's built through repetition. Through showing up when nothing glamorous is happening. Through being present when no one is watching. through not exploiting proximity for personal gain. Markus passed that test repeatedly, and Meghan noticed. Because when you're building something fragile, you notice who handles it carefully. She was learning who to keep close, who to keep at a distance, who to smile at, and who to listen to. Markus was someone she listened to. That much is clear from the consistency alone. And consistency is evidence. During these years, her romantic relationships came and went. Some were serious, some were public, some were messy. But Markus didn't shift. He didn't compete. He didn't disappear. He didn't insert himself where he didn't belong. He stayed exactly where he was, which suggests his role wasn't emotional dependency. It was strategic stability. That's rare, and that rarity made him valuable. Here's another uncomfortable question. Why didn't these romantic partners disrupt his presence? Why wasn't he pushed out? Because people don't threaten relationships they don't misunderstand. And none of them seemed threatened by him. That tells you something. Markus wasn't perceived as competition. He was perceived as infrastructure. Like a wall. Always there. Unmovable. Unquestioned. But walls do more than support. They also separate. They define boundaries. They protect what's inside. And Markus was part of the boundary between Meghan's public and private selves. He knew what stayed in and what stayed out. This period of her life was about building layers. Public face, professional identity, private support system. Markus existed in the innermost layer, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. And earning it without exposure is the hardest thing to do. Most people want recognition. He wanted longevity. Think about how dangerous ambition can be when it's visible. People project onto it. They resist it. They sabotage it. But when ambition is quiet, it moves freely. Markus helped keep it quiet. Not hidden. Focused. Directed. There's a difference. And Meghan learned that difference early. She learned when to speak, when to listen, when to reveal, and when to say nothing at all. Those skills don't come naturally. They're learned. Usually from someone who has already made the mistakes. Someone who has already watched others fail. Someone who knows how thin the line is between opportunity and exposure. Markus had walked that line before she ever tried, and she trusted him because he never pushed her forward recklessly. He didn't rush her. He didn't oversell her. He didn't force moments. He allowed timing to do its work. That's patience. And patience is rare in ambitious environments. But it pays off. As her career began to stabilize, something interesting happened. Markus didn't step back. He didn't hand her off to a new circle. He integrated. That's important. Because many early supporters fade once success arrives. They either feel replaced or irrelevant. Markus didn't. He adapted again, which suggests his value wasn't tied to her neediness. It was tied to her trajectory. And trajectories don't end. They evolve. This chapter of Meghan's life shaped how she approached relationships moving forward. She learned the difference between people who wanted access and people who understood timing, between people who wanted proximity and people who valued discretion. Markus fell firmly into the second category, which brings us to a crucial realization. By the time Meghan entered the phase of her life that would change everything, she already had a blueprint, a way of moving, a way of trusting, a way of keeping certain relationships undefined for a reason. And Markus was central to that blueprint, not as a headline, but as a constant. So when the next chapter began, when her life intersected with a world far more powerful, far more controlled, and far more dangerous, she didn't step into it unprepared. She brought her infrastructure with her, and Markus was part of it. But what happened when that quiet, carefully managed world collided with global scrutiny? What happens when a relationship built on discretion is forced to exist in the shadow of the most public institution on earth? The moment Prince Harry entered Meghan Markle's life, everything changed. Not just her day-to-day reality, not just her public perception, but the dynamics she had cultivated for years. Suddenly, private circles became scrutinized. Old patterns collided with new expectations. The media's gaze sharpened. The public's curiosity intensified. And yet, one constant remained: Markus Anderson. Ask yourself this. How often does someone manage to stay relevant when everything around them shifts? Friends drift away. Advisors become obsolete. Connections fracture. Yet Markus stayed. He didn't insert himself. He didn't compete. He didn't attempt to steer her personal life. He simply continued to exist at the precise intersection of trust and discretion. Now, let's step back and consider the timing. Harry's introduction wasn't just another romantic chapter. It was a seismic shift. The stakes were enormous. A royal relationship is not private by design. Every move is public, every word analyzed. Every friend, ally, and associate becomes a matter of scrutiny. And in that environment, how do you preserve the relationships that matter most? By making sure the right ones are invisible. Markus, by now, was more than a friend, more than a confidant, more than a presence. He was part of the scaffolding that allowed Meghan to navigate this new world. But here's the twist nobody talks about. Staying in the background is harder when the spotlight is blinding. Imagine being adjacent to a relationship that dominates global headlines. Imagine watching someone you've known for decades become the center of scrutiny that most people can't comprehend. Imagine being responsible for protecting private truths while every misstep is magnified. Markus didn't step back. He adapted. He moved when needed. He stayed when needed. He observed when most people would have panicked. This wasn't casual. This wasn't happenstance. This was a role he had perfected over decades. And Meghan recognized it. She understood the value of constancy in an environment designed to make everyone else temporary. Now let's dig deeper into the emotional dimension. Many will assume that a friend staying so close during a high-profile relationship must create tension. But that's the misconception. Markus never imposed. He never overstepped. That restraint made him indispensable. He was safe. He was consistent. He was reliable. And safety is currency when the world is watching. But there's more. Markus wasn't just present. He was influential. Not in a way that interfered with her choices, but in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. He helped Meghan read rooms, understand social hierarchies, and assess who could be trusted. He wasn't shaping decisions overtly. He was guiding understanding, providing a framework within which she could navigate her life safely. Think about it. How many of us have someone who can provide that type of counsel without imposing? That type of insight without interference? Very few. Now, consider what happened when Meghan's public life collided with the private world Markus inhabited. Suddenly, every decision carried amplified consequences. Every public appearance, every media narrative, every relationship became a vector for scrutiny. And through all of it, Markus remained a constant. Ask yourself this. How much of her composure, her ability to navigate those treacherous waters, can be attributed to having someone like him quietly supporting her? Someone who understood the pressures before they became crises? Someone who had seen the patterns repeat and could predict them before anyone else? Here's another twist. The dynamics between Markus and Harry. This is the moment where most people assume tension. The old confidant versus the new partner. Competition, jealousy, interference. But evidence suggests otherwise. Markus didn't compete. He didn't push. He didn't undermine. In fact, he remained precisely where he had always been, a stabilizing presence. That's rare, and it's remarkable, because when you're dealing with a high-profile relationship, people often want to replace the old support systems with new ones. Markus was not replaced. He was retained, and that retention speaks volumes. It indicates trust. It indicates understanding. It indicates an unspoken acknowledgement that some relationships are too foundational to disrupt. Which brings us to a critical point. Public perception versus private reality. The world assumed Meghan's story with Harry was the center of everything. And it was, in public terms. But privately, the infrastructure supporting her stability, her capacity to maintain composure, to make calculated decisions, to remain centered, relied on figures like Markus. This is where most narratives fail. They focus on the drama of the romance, the intrigue of the palace, the public conflicts. But the hidden relationships, the quiet stabilizers, the silent advisors, these are the relationships that actually shape outcomes. Now ask yourself, if Markus had been absent at this crucial juncture, how different might the trajectory have been? Would decisions have been made as carefully? Would the stress of constant scrutiny have been as manageable? Would she have retained the agency she clearly demonstrated throughout? Markus's influence is subtle, almost invisible. But subtlety doesn't equate to insignificance. And subtlety is the tool that makes him irreplaceable. Here's the final thought before we move forward. Influence doesn't always require visibility. Loyalty doesn't always require recognition. And presence doesn't always require explanation. Markus Anderson embodies all three. And when Meghan stepped into the most scrutinized chapter of her life, she didn't step alone. She brought decades of understanding, support, and stability with her. And that foundation was invisible to everyone except those who knew where to look. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than words. And in Meghan Markle's life, the silence surrounding Markus Anderson had spoken for decades. It was never loud. It was never claimed. It was never explained. Yet, its presence was unmistakable. By this point, patterns were emerging, if you were paying attention. Every major shift in Meghan's life coincided with Markus's presence. Not coincidentally, not sporadically, but repeatedly, consistently, and almost predictably. Take her career moves. Television roles, auditions, networking events. Markus was nearby. He wasn't acting as an agent. He wasn't negotiating contracts. He was observing, guiding subtly, facilitating connections without stepping into the limelight. That's not casual. That's not happenstance. That's influence, exercised quietly. Now, let's talk about timing again. Every time Meghan faced a new challenge, a contract dispute, an audition, a public scrutiny moment, Markus had already mapped the terrain. He had already considered the people involved. He had already assessed who could be trusted and who could not. And that assessment allowed Meghan to navigate her environment with far more clarity than most people realized. Ask yourself, how many friends can do that without expecting recognition or control? Very few. And yet, he did it repeatedly. This is where the story becomes fascinating. Because while the public narrative framed Meghan's rise as a mix of talent and luck, the private narrative, the one visible only to those who looked carefully, was one of careful orchestration, mentorship, and insight. Markus wasn't the architect. He wasn't the star. But he was the stabilizer, the constant, the unseen hand helping her navigate paths few could even perceive. Here's another layer, emotional support. Some people assume that influence is strictly professional. That guidance is only about strategy. Not in this case. Markus had seen Meghan through heartbreaks, disappointments, and betrayals. He had been there when others had left, when the world was indifferent, and when isolation was the only reality she knew. Presence during hardship is more revealing than presence during triumph. And his presence revealed trustworthiness, discretion, and loyalty, qualities often underestimated in public narratives. Let's be honest, the media loves simplicity. The world loves categories. Friend, partner, confidant, colleague. But Markus didn't fit neatly into any box, which is exactly why his role was always minimized publicly. Just a friend was convenient, digestible, and uncontroversial. But convenient doesn't mean accurate, because anyone who studied patterns could see the truth. Markus's involvement was constant, pervasive, and essential. By the time Meghan's romantic life became headline news, Markus's role was well established. He didn't compete with her partners. He didn't insert himself where he didn't belong. He simply remained observant, supportive, quiet. That kind of constancy creates influence without interference. Ask yourself again, who in your life can do that? Who can remain consistent across decades, through professional transitions, personal upheavals, and global scrutiny, without seeking recognition? Few, if any. And yet, there he was. This is where the story intersects with timing again. Because when Prince Harry entered the picture, the dynamics shifted dramatically. Not in a way that displaced Markus. Not in a way that reduced his relevance. But in a way that tested it. The world was watching. The stakes were enormous. Public opinion fluctuated wildly. Every word, gesture, and association was under scrutiny. And in that environment, Markus's discretion was more valuable than ever. He understood boundaries. He respected them. He maintained them. And that is rare in a world dominated by exposure, opinion, and judgment. Consider what that meant for Meghan. She wasn't just navigating a relationship with a prince. She was navigating media narratives, public expectation, and private vulnerability. All at the same time. Having someone like Markus present meant she had a stabilizing force. Someone who had already endured, observed, and learned from similar pressures. Someone who could offer guidance without claiming credit. Someone who could ensure the private world remained intact while the public world raged. Now, here's where it becomes particularly compelling. Markus didn't just remain constant. He adapted. He didn't resist change. He integrated it. Every new chapter in Meghan's life required flexibility. Every new relationship, every career opportunity, every move demanded recalibration. Markus didn't just tolerate the changes. He accommodated them. He anticipated them. Which means his influence wasn't about control. It was about facilitation. He wasn't orchestrating events for personal gain. He was creating a framework within which Meghan could act freely, safely, and strategically. That's a subtle kind of power. A quiet power that rarely makes headlines, yet shapes outcomes more profoundly than visible authority ever could. And it raises questions no one wanted to ask publicly. If Markus was so influential, why wasn't he discussed more openly? Why were all mentions minimized? Why did the narrative insist on just a friend? Because discretion protects influence. Because invisibility preserves trust. Because the less the world understands, the more control remains in the hands of those who do. Markus was protected by ambiguity, but he was effective precisely because of it. And that's the paradox. The less people recognized him, the more power he had to shape events quietly. Think about that carefully. Because as Meghan's life became increasingly public, as her actions were dissected and interpreted constantly, Markus's subtle influence became both more critical and more invisible. His presence was a stabilizing force amid chaos. His silence was strategic. And his loyalty was unwavering. Which brings us to an unavoidable point. Influence is not always visible. Loyalty is not always acknowledged. Presence is not always credited. Markus Anderson embodies all three. And the next chapter of Meghan's life, the period that would test the limits of loyalty, trust, and discretion, would reveal the full extent of that influence. Because even the most patient, discreet, and loyal relationships can be challenged when stakes are high, pressures are constant, and the world's gaze becomes unrelenting. The palace isn't just a building. It's a world, a set of rules, hierarchies, and expectations that operate both in plain sight and in shadow. When Meghan Markle stepped into that world, she didn't just marry a prince. She entered an institution with centuries of tradition, scrutiny, and invisible codes. And in that world, Markus Anderson remained by her side. Not publicly, not formally, not in a way anyone could easily track. But he was there, always. Ask yourself this. How does someone who has been a constant for decades survive the pressures of royal life without being noticed? Discretion, timing, patience. It's a rare combination. And Markus had mastered it. The palace demanded appearances. The media demanded narratives. The public demanded simplicity. But real influence rarely operates in the spotlight. Markus understood that. He moved quietly, stepped back when necessary, and appeared precisely when it mattered. This wasn't about status or titles. It was about survival. Because the moment you enter the public eye at that scale, every relationship is tested. Every boundary is challenged. Every private ally is scrutinized. And yet, Markus remained untouched by interference or drama. Why? Because his role wasn't transactional. It wasn't about power grabs. It was about constancy, loyalty, insight. Think about the stress Meghan faced inside the palace. Public protocol, media pressure, constant judgment. Who do you turn to when no one else can fully understand the stakes? Markus. He had already guided her through less intense, but equally complex, environments. He understood discretion, timing, and influence. He understood when to advise, when to listen, when to remain invisible. And that knowledge became indispensable. Let's consider another factor, isolation. Few people understand what it means to live under constant scrutiny, to have your every move analyzed, your words picked apart, your intentions questioned, to be surrounded by both allies and observers who may not have your best interests at heart. In that environment, isolation isn't just physical, it's psychological, emotional, strategic. Markus was the anchor against that isolation. The one familiar point in a world full of unfamiliar rules. The person who didn't need validation, didn't need recognition, didn't need credit. He was a stabilizer. And that stabilization wasn't passive. It was subtle, strategic, and highly effective. He was present at critical moments, often unseen. His guidance wasn't documented. His role wasn't publicized. But the results were undeniable. Meghan navigated the challenges with a confidence few could have managed alone. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. Relationships like these don't exist without rules, understood implicitly. Boundaries are clear. Roles are defined. Expectations are silent but rigid. Marcus respected those boundaries. He knew the palace's unspoken codes. He knew when to step in and when to retreat. And that discipline is what allowed him to remain. Imagine being in Meghan's position. Every interaction, every conversation, every decision scrutinized. Who do you trust? Who remains constant? Who offers counsel without creating exposure or scandal? Marcus. He was the rare person who could operate in that gray zone. Gray zones are where real power lies. It's not the loud authority that shapes outcomes. It's the invisible influence that guides decisions quietly. Marcus had positioned himself precisely in that zone. By now, patterns are unmistakable. He wasn't simply a background figure. He was embedded in the framework of Meghan's life. And embedded figures matter the most when systems become rigid, pressures become public, and scrutiny becomes intense. Now, consider the challenge: navigating a marriage that is both deeply personal and intensely public. The palace demands appearances. The media thrives on speculation. Every ally and associate is observed. And yet, Marcus remained. His silence protected both parties. His presence supported without interference. His loyalty never wavered. Which raises the question: how many people can survive in that environment without exposure, misinterpretation, or displacement? Very few. And Marcus was one of them. Now, the emotional dimension must be addressed. The palace is isolating. The pressures are relentless. Allies are rare. Confidants are rarer. Marcus provided that rare stabilizing force. Not as a protector in the overt sense. Not as a manipulator. Not as a figure claiming credit. But as a steadying presence, a quiet observer, and a discreet guide. Presence in such moments carries enormous weight. The difference between composure and chaos often hinges on unseen support. Marcus provided that. And his role became even more critical when Meghan began speaking publicly about personal experiences. When she disclosed challenges, expectations, and pressures, the constancy of private support mattered more than ever. Because public statements, media attention, and scrutiny can erode stability. The only way to survive is to have a foundation that remains untouched by external narratives. And Marcus was that foundation. Think about that carefully. Because when the most public chapters of Meghan's life unfolded, the private stabilizers determined how she navigated them. The public rarely sees these forces, but they shape outcomes profoundly. The question becomes unavoidable. If Marcus had not been present during these intensely public, high-pressure moments, how would the trajectory have changed? Would she have made different choices? Different moves? Different statements? Different alliances? The answer isn't speculative. It's embedded in patterns of trust, consistency, and influence that he maintained for decades. And those patterns didn't break when the palace demanded conformity or scrutiny. They adapted. Which brings us to the final, crucial point of this chapter. Discretion is power. The less the world knows, the more influence endures. The less exposure, the more loyalty holds. The quieter the presence, the deeper the impact. Markus Anderson exemplifies this principle. And as Meghan's life moved deeper into global attention, the challenges that lay ahead would force every hidden dynamic to reveal itself. Because even the most discreet presence can be tested. Even the most loyal confidant can be scrutinized. Even the quietest support can face pressures that expose its limits. Sometimes the loudest moments in someone's life are defined not by what is said, but by what remains unsaid. In Meghan Markle's journey, the silence around Markus Anderson was deafening. He was never in the headlines. He never made statements. He never inserted himself into controversies. And yet, his presence shaped the story. By now, patterns are clear. Every major life decision, every career pivot, every personal challenge coincided with Marcus's quiet, consistent presence. He wasn't a manipulator. He wasn't a public figure. He didn't demand attention. But he guided. He stabilized. He ensured that the foundation she built remained intact while the world raged around her. Now, let's examine the paradox of visibility and influence. Most people think power comes from being seen, from being heard, from dominating narratives. But some of the most potent influence exists in the shadows. Marcus operated there. He was invisible to the public eye, yet central to outcomes. He understood the subtle levers that determine success and survival in high-stakes environments. This is critical, because as Meghan's profile skyrocketed, the stakes of public scrutiny increased exponentially. Decisions that once had private consequences now carried global ramifications. And in those moments, having someone like Markus nearby wasn't a luxury. It was essential. Ask yourself, how do you navigate a world where every action is dissected and every misstep is amplified? Who do you trust? Who do you rely on? Who can provide guidance without creating exposure? Markus. Now, consider his unique ability to maintain discretion. Many people fail under attention. Many people cannot remain neutral when the spotlight shines. Markus, however, remained consistent. He didn't compete with romantic partners. He didn't challenge authority. He didn't seek recognition. He simply was. And that is powerful. It's the kind of loyalty that doesn't demand acknowledgement but shapes outcomes in profound ways. As Meghan moved through the pressures of royal life, she relied on this invisible support. Markus's quiet presence allowed her to process challenges, make calculated decisions, and maintain a sense of agency that few around her could match. And here's where the story gets particularly interesting. The world only sees the public interactions, the headlines, the speeches. But behind closed doors, private dynamics determine how someone navigates intense scrutiny. Markus's presence ensured that Meghan could navigate these pressures with clarity. His influence wasn't obvious. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective. Think about the magnitude of this support. A life under constant observation. Relationships scrutinized. Decisions analyzed globally. Every move dissected. Who else could provide stability in that environment? Few, if any. And yet, Markus did. Now, consider emotional support. Many people underestimate how critical emotional steadiness is in high-pressure situations. Markus wasn't simply a guide. He was a stabilizing force. He was someone who had witnessed failures, successes, and pivots. Someone who could provide perspective without judgment. And that perspective is rare. In environments dominated by visibility, loyalty, and trust become currencies of enormous value. Markus held both. By the time Meghan became a global figure, her ability to make deliberate choices depended in part on the constancy of his support. He wasn't controlling. He wasn't dominating. He wasn't seeking credit. He was guiding, supporting, preserving. And as Meghan's life became increasingly public, the challenges would intensify. Every interview, every speech, every public appearance increased the scrutiny on her relationships. And yet, Markus remained discreet. His silence protected both of them. His presence stabilized outcomes. His loyalty endured without fanfare. This is the paradox of his role. Unseen, yet essential. Discreet, yet influential. Silent, yet shaping history. As Meghan faced increasing pressure, the need for a stabilizing presence became unavoidable. And Markus fulfilled that need, quietly navigating every twist and turn. But even the most discreet presence can be tested. Even the most loyal confidant can face scrutiny, challenge, or misinterpretation. By now, the pattern is undeniable. Markus Anderson was never simply a background figure. He wasn't incidental. He wasn't a casual acquaintance who drifted in and out of Meghan Markle's life. He was constant. And that constancy is what made him so crucial, so powerful, and ultimately, so fascinating. Let's step back and examine the context. Meghan's life by this stage had shifted dramatically. She had moved from the relative anonymity of an aspiring actress to a global public figure. Every decision was scrutinized, every move dissected, every word analyzed. It's the kind of environment most people cannot survive without losing some sense of themselves. Yet, she navigated it with remarkable composure. And Markus played a part in that. Not in a visible way, not in a way anyone could trace, but in a profound, stabilizing way. Ask yourself, how do you preserve agency when the world expects you to be controlled? Who supports you without interfering? Who remains loyal without seeking recognition? Markus. This is where the subtlety of influence becomes clear. Most people think influence is about visibility. They think power is about being seen and heard. But some of the most potent influence exists precisely in the shadows. Markus had mastered this. He didn't make headlines. He didn't issue statements. He didn't intrude. He simply existed in the spaces where trust mattered most. And trust is rare. By the time Meghan was navigating the pressures of a royal life, public appearances, media scrutiny, relentless speculation. The ability to trust someone completely is invaluable. Markus provided that trust. He had been a steady presence long before the world cared, long before the red carpets, long before cameras followed her every step. And that history gave him insight, understanding, and perspective that no one else could provide. Now, let's explore emotional intelligence. Markus wasn't just a stabilizing presence. He was perceptive. He understood the dynamics at play, both publicly and privately. He knew when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to provide counsel. That kind of awareness doesn't come from casual friendships. It comes from deep observation, experience, and alignment. And he had all three. Consider what this meant for Meghan. In a world dominated by appearances, where every relationship is scrutinized, the ability to maintain a confidant who is discreet, reliable, and deeply understanding is a rare asset. Markus wasn't replacing anyone. He wasn't competing with romantic partners or professional allies. He was complementing the environment she had to navigate. And that complementarity is what made him indispensable. Now, think about timing. Every life transition, every personal and professional pivot, coincided with Markus's continued presence. Coincidence? Perhaps. But repeated patterns over decades suggest otherwise. He appeared when he was needed most. He remained when others drifted away. He adapted to circumstances rather than attempting to control them. That is subtle influence at its finest. And here's where the story becomes even more compelling. The public only sees events, headlines, statements, appearances. But behind the headlines, hidden relationships shape outcomes profoundly. Markus was part of that hidden framework. By maintaining discretion, he preserved trust. By remaining consistent, he ensured loyalty. By adapting quietly, he facilitated stability. And that combination allowed Meghan to navigate pressures few could endure. Ask yourself, how many people can provide that level of support without seeking credit, without demanding recognition, and without altering the natural course of events? Very few. And Markus did it repeatedly. That's influence without exposure, loyalty without fanfare, presence without intrusion. As Meghan's life continued to expand, as public scrutiny intensified, as challenges became more complex, Markus's role became even more critical. Every interview, every media narrative, every royal protocol demanded discretion, and Markus's presence ensured that discretion was maintained. Now, consider the stakes. The higher the visibility, the greater the risk of exposure. Every misstep could be amplified. Every perceived weakness could become global news. And yet, Markus remained invisible to the public eye, yet profoundly impactful behind the scenes. That is rare. That is extraordinary. And it highlights a principle often overlooked. The most important figures in our lives are not always the most visible. Sometimes, they are the ones whose consistent presence allows us to navigate complexity with composure, confidence, and clarity. Markus exemplifies that principle. And as Meghan moved deeper into the global spotlight, the subtlety of his influence would be tested like never before. Because even the most loyal, discreet, and stabilizing relationships can be challenged when the stakes are astronomical and the world is watching. What happens when discretion is tested? When loyalty is scrutinized? When influence must operate under pressure? By now, it's impossible to ignore the truth. Markus Anderson was woven into the fabric of Meghan Markle's life in a way few outsiders could perceive, but that fundamentally shaped her journey. Think about it. This wasn't a casual friendship. This wasn't someone who drifted in and out depending on convenience. This was a decades-long presence, constant, reliable, discreet. And that constancy is exactly what made him so influential. Let's focus on the transition period when Meghan's life exploded into global attention. The wedding, the press frenzy, the royal protocols, the scrutiny, every step of her life under the microscope. Most people assume relationships in that context either collapse or become publicized. Allies are thrust into visibility. Friends are scrutinized. Confidants are forced to reveal themselves. Not Markus. He remained consistent. Invisible publicly, yet indispensable privately. Now, consider the emotional complexity of such a situation. Meghan was under pressure like few people can comprehend. Every move evaluated. Every statement dissected. Every relationship questioned. Who could she rely on to provide perspective without judgment? who could help navigate the personal and public maze simultaneously. Markus. And this isn't hypothetical. The patterns are clear. Wherever Meghan faced pivotal moments, career decisions, personal challenges, media storms, Markus's presence coincided with her ability to remain grounded, composed, and deliberate. Ask yourself, how many people can consistently influence outcomes without inserting themselves into the narrative? Without seeking recognition? Without altering decisions for personal gain? Very few. And Markus did it, again and again. Now, let's talk about timing and alignment. Markus appeared not just at random, but precisely when guidance, stability, or perspective was necessary. Not to control outcomes, not to dominate, not to manipulate, but to stabilize, advise subtly, and provide insight. That's influence refined to its quietest, most effective form. And it's rare. Most relationships fracture under pressure, under scrutiny, under the gaze of the world. Markus's did not. Instead, it strengthened, because it was rooted in discretion, loyalty, and deep understanding. By this point, patterns emerge that are impossible to ignore. Markus is present during life transitions. He remains through chaos. He adapts when circumstances shift. He doesn't compete with romantic partners. He doesn't seek visibility. He simply exists where he is most needed, quietly, strategically, loyally. And that makes him extraordinary. Now, let's examine another dimension, emotional intelligence. Markus's influence wasn't just logistical. It was deeply perceptive. He understood the environment Meghan faced, both the visible pressures and the hidden dynamics. He knew when to advise, when to observe, when to remain silent. This kind of emotional acuity is invaluable, particularly when navigating a world as public and unforgiving as the British monarchy. It allows the supported party, Meghan, in this case, to act with clarity, confidence, and deliberation, even when external forces are chaotic. Ask yourself, how many people can provide that level of support consistently without seeking control, without demanding acknowledgement, without altering the natural flow of events? Few, if any. And yet Markus did it for decades. His role was a stabilizing framework for Meghan's decisions, relationships, and public persona. And here's the paradox. The less the world sees, the more influence endures. The quieter the presence, the deeper the impact. The less acknowledgement, the more trust solidifies. Markus's discretion protected both his influence and Meghan's ability to navigate a world under constant surveillance. Now consider the stakes. Public scrutiny wasn't just intense, it was global. Every action, every gesture, every word could be interpreted, misinterpreted, or weaponized. And yet, Markus remained a constant. Not because he was immune to the pressure, but because he had learned the art of subtlety, timing, and patience. Influence, loyalty, and stability are rarely recognized publicly. They operate in the shadows, shaping outcomes quietly. Markus Anderson exemplifies that principle. By now, it's impossible to view Meghan Markle's rise without acknowledging the quiet, powerful presence of Markus Anderson. He was never a headline. He never appeared in interviews. He never sought public recognition. And yet, he was a force shaping the trajectory of her life for decades. The next stage of Meghan's story wasn't just about fame or fortune. It was about pressure. Immense, unrelenting pressure. The wedding had catapulted her into global attention. Every gesture, every comment, every interaction was dissected, scrutinized, and interpreted. The media's gaze was relentless. The public's expectations were suffocating. And in that world, support systems mattered more than ever. Friends who drift away under stress. Advisors whose self-interest overtakes loyalty. Allies who crack under pressure. Markus did not. He remained a constant. Discreet, loyal, and perceptive. Ask yourself, how rare is that? To have someone present not for credit, not for visibility, not for control, but purely for stability and guidance? Very few can provide it, and fewer can maintain it under global scrutiny. That is influence refined to its most potent form. Invisible, consistent, effective. Now consider the emotional dimension. Markus had observed Meghan for decades. He had seen her navigate disappointments, heartbreaks, and obstacles. He understood her patterns, her reactions, and her vulnerabilities. That knowledge isn't casual. It's intimate. Not in a romantic sense necessarily, but in a way that allows someone to stabilize and guide without intervention. And that's exactly what he did. The palace environment amplified the stakes. Public appearances, media speculation, protocol, and tradition combined to create pressures unlike anything Meghan had faced before. Every ally and confidant became essential, yet easily replaceable if they failed under pressure. Markus was indispensable precisely because he didn't fail under pressure. He maintained perspective, guided subtly, and provided support without intrusion. His presence allowed Meghan to navigate her circumstances with clarity and confidence. Now, here's where the story gets even more compelling. Markus's influence was invisible, yet measurable in outcomes. Every decision Meghan made, every challenge she overcame, every pivot she executed successfully carried the imprint of the framework Markus helped her build. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about manipulation. It wasn't about ego. It was about constancy, stability, insight, timing. Ask yourself, how often does the world recognize the invisible scaffolding that allows